So the only real reason to go to the straight pride parade is to basically tell the world, I don't like the gay people and they're getting attention and I don't like how much they're pushing into society. That's really the only reason you would go to that fucking parade. And let me tell you something else that pissed me off. A lot of people accusing me of virtue signaling. I mean, even the nature of telling somebody that they're virtue signaling because I want to go online, because I got a fucking brother who lives in the South, who still in the South could lose his job. I'm not saying he is in danger of losing his job, but people in the South can fire you if you're gay. I have a daughter who identifies as bisexual. She's 13 years old. Will she be bisexual? I don't fucking know. But right now, that's what she says. She goes to school these days. She's wearing a pride parade, paint a pride flag on her face. That connects with her, that culture. I think I'm virtue signaling. No, these are people in my life that I love. These are people in my life that I am fiercely protective of. So the idea that part of my social media footprint, I'm going to talk about these things passionately. Yeah, that's not virtue signaling. That's me expressing things that are important to me. The fact that you would even assume it's virtue signaling is probably a little homophobic. And if it's about women, it's probably a little misogynistic, because if the only reason you can imagine somebody who isn't gay, lesbian, bi, or who isn't a woman would publicly talk about, or who isn't black or Muslim, that would publicly talk about how challenging it can be in 2019 to be one of those minority groups. If the only reason you think someone's having that conversation is that they're virtue signaling, then you're probably the thing that I hate, which is a misogynist, a homophobe, a xenophobe. That's just the way that is, because why would you? I'm not saying there aren't people who virtue signal. There are. But most people don't, and I certainly don't. What benefit would it do me? What benefit would it do me? Not a goddamn thing. I like how Hogwash says in Alabama, you get fired for being gay, but you get a promotion for incest. You know what, man? That's my Alabama you're talking about, and you're not wrong.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Confiscate Art stream. My name is Brian. I'm sorry Luke couldn't make it on the stream today. Luke, it's okay, man. We'll set another time. I understand. Some days are harder than others. Believe me, I understand. What with everything that's going on with YouTube and shit, it's pretty challenging times. So, what you guys heard before the show started, that was not I Am Serious. Come on now. You know he doesn't please not like that. That was actually David Jaffe. David Jaffe, the creator, I guess you could say the, what would you call him? He was a video game developer, the guy behind, the mind behind Twisted Metal and God of War. Two of some of the edgiest games, actually, that were out. And I've had, I've had Jaffe on Honey Badger Radio a few times to talk about, mostly, you know, about gender and stuff like that. He's somebody that I still respect. But that's the reason why it makes that video that he made. He took a clip out of his live stream and made a video called I Don't Virtue Signal with an exclamation mark, where he rants a little bit about the straight pride parade in Boston. And then he rants at length about the idea that being accused of virtue signaling is something that is worthy of, I guess, scorn, like in that saying that, you know, your virtue signaling is an effort to diminish what you believe in, I guess. And the reason why I thought about thinking about this, so I'm going to keep working. I'm going to try and talk and work at the same time. It's not going to be easy for me, though. I got to tell you, it's not easy. The thing that's interesting about it is I don't think that David Jaffe is a progressive. I don't. And I know that a lot of people say, well, the problem is progressives, right? They're the ones that do this. They're the ones that create this kind of, progressive stack, the victim hierarchy, and that most people are not like that. Like, normal people are not like that. And I think that's a mistake. I think that's a mistake to say, because I think that progressive ideology is mainstream. And it's not just weirdos. You know, as Ethan Van Sciver calls them, he basically said, Zach, your boy Zach, he says, childless weirdos to describe progressives. Authoritarian progressives. I'm telling you, they're not fringe. There are many people that I would say aren't progressives, but they believe in progressive ideas because they don't find that to be controversial to do. It's exactly the same argument that I've been making for feminism, where people say, feminism, look at this study, like Milo Yiannopoulos will bring it up, or used to. Look at this study that says that this number of people don't identify as feminists. Well, while we know that the feminists find it really important that people identify with their movement, that's why they're always doing these campaigns to say, why don't you call yourself a feminist? It just means equality. It doesn't matter, because the average person still believes in feminist ideas, or they believe in the good feminism of yesteryear, or the good feminism of this other country. And I think that the same thing works with progressivism in general. I mean, progressivism is feminism. And David Jaffe's not a progressive. He considers himself to be moderate, but he doesn't want to be a homophobe. And this is the big challenge, because in order to honestly challenge the mainstream progressive notions, and they are mainstream notions, right? That gays should be protected, like they're a special class of people, that Muslims are a special class of people that should be protected, that women in particular are a special class, minorities, whatever, okay? People of other races, which again is a term that I don't like. I think race is the most misleading term that we have for a group, and I think that's by design, but whatever. And most people believe that, and they never question it, and you're not allowed to question it. You're not allowed. You can't question that at all. You can't say, well, that's why, when I talk about race, people are like, Brian, don't go down that road, right? Well, when you say that to me, I'm going to go down that road. And the fact that the average person won't do it, it shows you how much control they have over the conversation. They absolutely have control over the conversation. And people don't have to call themselves progressives to participate in their bullshit. And they do all the time. Like I said, David Jaffe's moderate. He's a liberal guy. But I think that, like, your average liberal is pretty moderate. But that doesn't mean that he's not still supporting them. It's like the guy, what's his name? The KGB guy said, it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter that there aren't many progressives, that they make up a small percentage of people. I've heard this repeated by many, many, many people. It's irrelevant, because most people adopt their teaching. Most people believe what they believe. So that means that progressivism won't die just because progressives themselves are silenced or owned. That's why feminism can, survive so much, because there are enough people that adopt its principles that it doesn't really matter. Like, you could all the, like, you know, as an example, right? All the leftists could catch a disease and die tomorrow. All the leftists could do that, right? All the feminists could die tomorrow, and feminism will make a comeback. And the reason why it will is because there's enough tradcons, moderates, conservatives, and even libertarians that believe in feminism to some extent, that it's only a matter of time before it goes back to being as crazy as it is now. It's like if you have a disease and the only thing you're dealing with, let's say it's a disease that eats away at your limbs, like you start to like lose feeling in your fingertips, and then they like, I don't know, they start to die and you have to like cut them off, right? If you only take care of the stuff that, like, if you only cut off the limbs that look like they're in their worst shape, it doesn't mean that you don't have the disease anymore. You have to like get it at the source, and that's the language itself, and that's understanding that these are mainstream ideas. They're not fringe. When Jaffe says, I care about my daughter who's, thinks she's bisexual or whatever, and, I see this not as virtue signaling, but just, caring about human beings who I care about, who I love, whatever. That is a sentiment that is relatively normal for regular people, and he is a normie. So when people say, well, it's just these progressives, that's bullshit. It's a mainstream idea. And, if you don't recognize that it is, you're doomed to repeat these. We're never gonna fix this problem. So it starts with that identification. Secondly, we have to recognize that there is a war on language itself. Like, as long as we're talking about stuff in the same, let's say, framework that the left created, they created the framework for the discussion, okay? As long as we're talking about things in their terms and don't challenge what they're talking about at all, then we'll never win, because they'll always have the advantage because we're playing on their terms. So when you say, well, like the conservatives do this a lot. I've seen like Shapiro and a lot of these like, I guess you could call them just like old school conservative types, but even a lot of people in the new right do this too. Candace Owens does it, and it's just, Dennis Prager does it, whatever, across the board. They go, the left are the real racists. Dinesh D'Souza was doing this. This is when I first started talking about this shit. Though the left are the real racists, the Democratic Party is the party of slavery. Okay. As long as you're doing that, you're not helping. You think that that's you're helping in the short run, but the problem is you're not, because you're telling people that you're talking about racism as though it is absolutely valid as it exists, and you're not challenging the paradigm in the first place. Feminism exists in the negative spaces that it has rotted into our brains. Yeah. Jaffe does not apprehend to the true scope of the false idolatry he is professing to follow. Slavery. Yeah. So like I say, what people should be doing is they should be asking questions like, what is racism? Why are we talking about this? Leon Trotsky coined the term. Don't you think that's fishy? That means that before Leon Trotsky coined the term racism, no one used it. So we're talking like during the time of slavery, no one talked about racism. Like that wasn't a concept that existed. So how is that possible? Like, what could life have been like? This is the reason why I said, I say this to my wife, but this is what I honestly believe. I bet that people coped better with, actually, you know what? I'll go further than that. I'll bet that during the times of slavery and even Jim Crow, when people said the word nigger, it didn't offend anyone. I think it was just a word people used. I think that whether it was said to be insulting or not, I bet it didn't exist. It didn't have the power that it has today back then. And I think that the reason for it is because that people weren't politicizing it back then. Imagine that, like, before we had let me just make an angry face on this guy here. Before we had race hustlers like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, like before there people like that existed, people whose job it was to create grievance, you know, in order to make money. Like, imagine, and I'm sure that there was always people like that, but imagine that using race as a tool to get people riled up, that wasn't a thing. Like, it didn't exist. Like, people who were slaves wanted to be free, but them being black had nothing to do with it. That wasn't on their mind. They were just essentially a conquered tribe that was sold by other black people, by Africans, to whoever wanted to buy them, and one of the people who bought them were whites. They were one of the people who bought them. Because, like, if you put slavery and racism in the context together, I think that it actually makes slavery as an idea harder to talk about. And I think that slavery as an idea doesn't need racism to be a bad idea. It's almost like people would tell you that if you diminish racism, then you're diminishing slavery. I would argue that racism and slavery don't have a relationship. And that's something else that's been created by race hustlers, by grievance, salesmen. Because there are races where, I mean, most people who were enslaved by people who looked like them. The Native Americans enslaved each other. The Middle Easterners, they enslaved other Middle Easterners. That has nothing to do with race. Africans enslaved Africans. Whites enslaved whites. Asians enslaved Asians. Orientals, whatever you want to call it. So, why is it now, when the word slavery is uttered, the only thing people can think of are black people being enslaved by white people? Despite the fact that in the grand scale of things, that's probably the least common type of slavery. And it's also not the most recent, because there are parts of the world where slavery is still going on, but nobody seems to care. So then what's the reason for it? The only thing we got is that there are people who politicize the suffering of other people, especially men in particular, to use it to get power and influence over others. It doesn't add up. It doesn't add up, in my opinion. And I hate it when conservatives play that game. Don't play the game that progressives got everyone else playing. Think for yourself and try to, like, come out of the box, because they're doing that. It's by design. As long as they have you trying to point the finger at someone else for being racist, then you are acknowledging and validating that there is an idea called racism. When if you really break it down, it doesn't add up. Like, if you made a list of every race and you looked at the list, it doesn't make any sense. The list would not make sense. You know what I mean? I think this guy's gonna be carrying a pipe. I was gonna make it another baseball bat, but I think it's gonna be a pipe. We need to make super chats to help creators appease Lord Mazza. Yeah, really. Racial bigotry existed before Trotsky. Yeah, but what did they call it? Like, did a name for it exist? And if there wasn't a name for it, why wasn't there a name for it? Because if we can identify, like, this is what I'm thinking about. Like, Did we, when people say the word sexism, what do they think of? They think of a woman being mistreated. When people think of the word racism, what do they think of? They think of a black person being mistreated by a white person, or any non-white person being mistreated by a white person. When Trotsky even coined the term racism, he was targeting white people. He was saying that it was a uniquely white construct. Why would he do that? Because he's using it. It's a tool. It's a tool to get him what he wants. Oops. It's not because he actually cares about people of different races. And what is racism? I would argue that racism, if you really got to break it down to something, it's tribalism based on cultural differences, some visual differences, but mostly it's cultural. Jonathan Haidt said the same thing. He said that what people call racism has a lot more to do with culture than race, because it's basically what people are, if they have a negative reaction, like a disgust reaction or something, it's because they're afraid of what those people might do or how they might affect it, not just because their skin color is going to do something. I mean, it acts as a kind of signifier. Yeah, sure. And then specifically, what within that group are they worried about? I think it's the men in that group that they're worried about, because that's what it is. I think that no one says, I'm worried about the women in this race doing something. Mostly it's the men of that race. Well, if the men of that race are a problem, then why don't we call it misandry? When a young man in the black community is killed by a police officer and Black Lives Matter gets all upset, they call it racism. But clearly it has more to do with him being a man than him being black, because there are black women that beat the shit out of their kids and raise them to act like women, essentially, to react emotionally to problems and so on. And by and large, except for other people that actually care about the black community, or they care about how kids are raised or whatever, that's not a problem. That doesn't result in a death. It was racial bigotry or racial prejudice. If we adjust racism to be based on culture, I'm afraid some of us would lose the ground to affect culture to make things better in certain groups. How is that a question? Oh, it's a comment. Okay. I don't know that means it's unworkable. I think that I just want to be accurate in the terms. So, let me see here. Just gonna finish drawing this leg. Oh shit. What is that? Oh. That guy's behind this guy, so I shouldn't draw that. It's such a mess at this point. It's hard to see. Let's okay. Here, damn it. I don't want to take too much time away from what I'm doing. But let's list off some races. I'm just going to write some down real quick over here, okay? So, tell me if I'm writing something wrong, but I'm going to list off races in the way described, in the way that they're used by the average person. Okay? So here we go. Races. All right? White, black, Asian, Mexican, Native. I mean Native American when I say that. Jew. I think if I say Muslim, they do say that that's racist. like that Muslims are a race, but I'm gonna try to be, I guess, a little bit more charitable, and I'll say Middle Eastern. Okay, that's a list I've made right there. Let's maybe instead of Mexican, I'll do Latino, or I'll leave it, because see, look, it already gets confusing. Okay, so white, how is that a race? Because, and I'm telling you, Mexican is treated like a race. So, and Arab is also treated like a race, even though that relates to a specific place. So with Asians, we're looking at a region, okay? That's a region of the world. And it's actually, oh yeah, how about Indian? That's another group right there, Open Bob. When I say Indian, I mean India, not native. So Asia is a region. But technically, Indian people are also Asian because India is part of the Asian continent. Now, when people say Asian, I know that you're going to say, yeah, but I know what they mean when they say it. But take that out of your brain for a second. Try not to say, I know what they mean when they say it, because I know that we're simplifying language for the purposes of getting down to, the general idea of what people mean when they say race. I'm trying to be very precise, okay? Precise. So, precise. Asian is a region. So this includes Indians, Chinese, Japanese, Indonesians, Thai, Burmese, whatever. It includes a large number of people. But, like Russia's part of Asia, and like we don't call Russians Asians. So the Asian thing is really messy. Because one more, Polynesian, and also, what is it, Aboriginal. Okay, so Asia is a region, but it's hard. I wouldn't say that it's a race. It's pretty vague. Okay, yeah, the Asian part of Russia is Asian, but that's my point. You see how messy this is? Okay, black. All right, well, that refers to the skin color, but when we say black, what are we talking about? Are we talking about Jamaicans, Belizeans? Are we talking about people who are Caribbean or Latino, but they have dark skin? Are those people black too? How is that its own race, and yet Latino is also its own race? How is that? Okay, yes, the term Oriental was meant to differentiate, but it meant from the Orient. But you see, you can't say Oriental anymore because that's not PC. Okay, I have another one. Okay, so black is only obvious insofar as you know it when you see it, but it also is extremely vague, because if you ask a Jamaican, an American black, and an African, the ways in which they were, or even like people within Africa, West Africans, East Africans, South Africans, okay? They likely, the only thing that they may share in common is the skin color, but culturally, they're probably very different, okay? African Americans to blacks that live in Canada to blacks that live in the UK, but I think that the term black is a bit blanket, especially again when you compare it to some of the other stuff we're going to get to, and the same thing goes for white, but I think the white one is actually the most interesting. Okay, so Mexicans, I mean, that's a nationality, that's not a race. You could say it's a culture, but typically a nationality comes with a culture kind of baked into it, right? So Mexicans are not a race, but we consider them a race. What race are Puerto Ricans? I don't know. That's my point. Like when I did my 23andMe, yeah, black usually means black in the US. Well, why? Like that. This is what I'm talking about. I think that for the purposes of describing African Americans, black is probably the best thing, because again, we're looking at people whose heritage is, usually is traced back to West African slaves. but not always, because some people emigrated here that are black, and you know, they may have been here for a few generations, and so you can't really tell. But it's almost like I guess that can work, but there are people in the UK that are black that would call themselves black too. It's really messy. So anyway, Mexicans, not a race. Native Americans, it's like Asians. Native American tribes, they may all have similar DNA, but they would probably consider themselves to be separate from each other, especially before, you know, Europeans like found the new world, as it were. The natives, and that's not even an accurate statement either, by the way. The Native Americans were not the natives. There was actually people here before them, and they wiped those people out, or at the very least drove them all south. If you don't know that, well, you know, now you know. So the natives were not the first Americans. They'd found this place too. So and so like, this is also messy, okay? Jew, that's not a race. That's why but when you criticize Jews, they can't say it's racist. They say it's anti-Semitic. But the Semitic people are not only Jews, they're Middle Easterns people. So like, some Jews are not Semitic, but they're Jews, and some Semitic people are not Jewish. So like, do you see how messy this is? Like, the word race just doesn't work. It doesn't work. All right, Indians from India. Well, Indians from India, again, this is a nationality. It's not a race. And Indians are Caucasian. So they're basically more closely related to white people than anybody else. They've just evolved to look like that because of where they were. You know, the climate changed them, basically. But they're white people. But we would never dare to call them white people. In fact, Indians don't want to call themselves white people. Okay? And here's another thing. Speaking of white people, blacks in America, they have white in them. So there's white in black people. So I'm gonna put an asterisk. There's white in Mexicans. There's like white in Native American people. There's white in Jewish people. There's white in Middle Eastern people. And there's white in Indian people. But none of them want to be white. They don't even want to acknowledge it a little bit. All right? Polynesians, we're talking about Hawaiians and the Rock, you know. They're basically a mix of everything. Puerto Ricans are like that too. Island people, they generally are like a big mix. So like, how is Polynesian a race if it's just a big mix? If it's basically like what you get when you mix all the races. And when I say all the races, I'm really shrugging at that, because technically, if we were to break it down into like the most fundamental characteristics of what we would call a race, there's only 4 races. 4. There's Orientals or Mongoloids, there's white people or Caucasoids, and there's blacks, there's Negroids, and then there's Aboriginals or Australoids, I think what they call them. And Polynesians are mostly a mix of white, the Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid, which is why they look like that. All right. So Polynesian, not a race either. It just means mulatto as fuck, like the most mulatto ever. Aboriginal is a race. That's why they look so different. If you ever seen the Aboriginals of Australia, they are, I would say that could be considered a race, or at the very least a phenotype. And then you have the Inuits. And the Inuits are basically just like, they're like the natives. So it's almost like redundant to put it in there, right? So like, now let's go to white. So how come, and this happens all the time, how come Hispanics that come from Mexico, Guatemala, Puerto Rico, Cuba, like Mr. Maza, for example, if you even just acknowledge that they are Hispanic, they get to call that racist. Like, just acknowledging Hispanicness exists or Latino-ness exists, they get to use that as a bludgeon, and they want to be distinct. So Latino, like activist types, right? They say, like, you know, Mexican culture is should be distinct and it's celebrated, and you have people that call themselves Mexican Americans and so on. Puerto Ricans are the same. They differentiate themselves from Mexicans. You have to get it right when you identify them, and like you can't like accidentally say that a Puerto Rican guy is Guatemalan or Salvadorian or Venezuelan or Mexican, because that's racist, and you better get it right. So they consider like each nationality within Latino culture its own race that you have to treat with equal respect. Asians do the same thing when they get active. So if like, I mean, active as in like woke, right? So that means that like, and Hollywood does this all the time with Asians. So they'll put like an Asian on the screen, and they'll have a scene where a white guy, because it's always a white guy, goes, hey, who's your Chinese friend over here? And then the person says, I'm not Chinese, I'm Korean, you bigot. And of course it's like, well, how the fuck does he know? But no, see, getting it wrong is racist, because Chinese people, Korean people, Indo-Asians, Filipinos, Japanese people, and so on, they're all Asians, they're all Orientals, but they have their own rules. And don't get it wrong, because each culture, Thai culture, Chinese culture, Japanese culture, Indonesian culture, and so on, they're all unique and should be loved and admired, right? And respected most of all, despite the fact that, you know, in general, the people look similar. Now, do we do that for white people? What does white mean? What does it mean, really? What does white encompass? White encompasses everything European. Italians, Greeks, French, German, English, Dutch, Norwegian, I mean, I can go on, right? Americans. So, like, whiteness is probably has like almost the most diversity
Adjunct
within.
professors don't get paid enough.
Yeah.
Blinking face.
Thank you, Zeranx. They have like a great amount of diversity in like their culture, right? Like, don't tell me that there isn't a difference between a Scottish culture and a Polish culture, and a Russian culture and a German culture, and, you know, the Swiss and the Swedes and the French and the Italians and so on, right? But we just call them all white. We just lump it all together with the Americans and the Canadians and so on. Why would you do that? Well, I can tell you why. Because the progressives, they hate white people. They hate whiteness. And when you do that, when you lump all of these people together, you get to say, white people don't have a culture. There's no such thing as white culture, which is what they do. But there is such a thing as Japanese culture, Chinese culture, Indonesian culture, Filipino culture. And there is such a thing as Venezuelan culture, Puerto Rican culture, Ecuadorian culture, Guatemalan culture, Mexican culture. Those exist and should be respected. There is such a thing as Inuit culture, First Nations peoples, the Sioux and the Apache and whatever, all the Cherokee, whatever. All of them have cultures that we have to like admire and we have to respect. But white people, despite the fact that they also have their own cultures, you're not allowed to treat them as such. In fact, we just ignore it and neglect it. That is by design. That is by design. This is the reason why I don't like talking about racism, because if you do that, you are playing their game. None of this looks like races to me. This is a hodgepodge. Some are nationalities, some are just skin colors, and that is also on purpose. Some are nationalities, some are skin colors, some of them are just cultures, some of them are religions. Some of them just relate to a region in general. How are those races? I'm not saying that there's no such thing as race, but I think that the terms are intentionally vague, and it's creating confusion, and it's by design. So those are my thoughts on that. And It's the reason why I'm gonna neglect, or not say neglect, but kind of reject that idea that hold on, what is this I'm drawing? Oh, it's a hand. I'm gonna reject that idea that, not that necessarily that race is a thing, but that racism as an idea has that much, I guess you could say, power in our culture. I don't think it does. I don't think it, and I think that playing that game is just, it's what they want, you know? Even if I'm wrong about all this, I should have the right to challenge these ideas. And that's ultimately what I'm saying. I think when people say white people have no culture, I think they mean white people in America are generic and boring and don't season their chicken. Yes, I know it's intended as an insult, but it's not only going to apply to American whites. I promise you they mean that about white people in general. Because once you start calling, when you say white, you are literally erasing all of the cultural nuance that European people have. And that's on purpose. Americans have a culture. And that's another thing too that I was thinking about. I was thinking about, why is it that we have gotten people to describe, how do I say this? How is it we've gotten people to describe Black Americans as African American, as though it exists outside of being American, just as people call themselves Asian Americans or Mexican American or whatever. It's almost like, because like if you really think about the term African American, it makes no sense. And I know it sounds like I'm like nitpicking, but I think that this is an important point though. Why would we call it African American when most blacks from America have never been to Africa? They may have their roots there, but they don't know anything about it. And Africans don't like black people. I think that, and I'm serious. Like I worked with Africans. Like when I was young, I worked in jobs where I was working with African immigrants, like straight up, like, you know, purple skinned Africans, like dark as fuck. And they were the most anti-black motherfuckers I've ever seen. The most. Like they could not stand black people. Why would blacks want to identify with that? Why, and what's wrong with just, you're American? What's wrong with that? And I think that people who reject that notion that they are American, they're playing that game too. Whether they want to or not, they're a part of that. They're participating in that victimhood Olympics, you know, nig picking. He's right at Brian Martinez. Who is? Iron Adam John. Racism is making collective judgments onto individuals. Progressives are the worst for this. They only view people in their collective group. Yeah, but it's by design. They want to turn, this is another thing too that I wanted to make a point about. They want to turn everyone against white people. That's why when it comes to any other group that they decide are not white, even if they are, they make them separate from whites. They basically have the schema of SJWs, of progressives, is this, okay? When it comes to race, there are white people and then there's everybody else. And everybody else is good and white people are bad. This is how, and of course they're working by their logic of what white people is. So they're not really saying, they say Caucasians, but they forget that people who are from India are also Caucasian. But they don't count them as white because they don't look white. Like they're not passing, I guess you could say. And so they say, well, you know, the problem is white people, whiteness. And I'm sick of that, but it is what they do. And it is an attack on white people. And you know, people from India and other kinds of like groups that could be considered white. Jews do it too. They play that game, right? The Jews act like they're not white. And what they don't realize is that most of the time when progressives are criticizing white privilege, they're talking about Jews. And they're the Jews don't seem to notice, or they don't care. A lot of times they participate in it. There's a lot of SJW Jews as well. I know that. I don't know if that's by design, or they're trying to separate themselves from white people by saying, I'm not white, I'm a Jew. I don't know, man. It's so fucked up, is what I'm saying. And I think that most progressives, they make that mistake. And not just progressives, I'm sorry. The average person makes the mistake of going along with this narrative. This is how you get Carlos Maza. Because when Carlos Maza cries racism, there are too many people that take it seriously enough to look into it without stopping to think, well, what if you're just being an asshole? Like, why do you have to accept their framework at all? Just because they say something is happening. Why do you have to accept it? I think it's more the case that Africans don't like Black American attitudes. At least that's what I've seen from Interaction My and concur, Brian. Well then, sure, I agree. That's why I didn't say they were racist. I think that's what it is. But because the problem they have is cultural. It's the problem with behavior. But then, like, you're kind of making my point. So when a white person, or any person for that matter, because the thing is that, you know, what we call racism, a lot of times, I think that blacks face more of that coming from non-whites than whites. Like Hispanics, you know, Latinos judge each other. They judge other Latinos, and they judge black people. You know? And I think that it's because of the exact same reason why Africans do. I think it's the same reason. That's what I'm getting at. You're making my point for me, right? I mean, black people judge black people. I had a friend that he was the biggest, wokest fucking SJW, and he was a black guy. And I know he was mixed because his last name was Mick something. I'm not going to give his name. I know what his name was, but I'm not going to dox him. And it's funny because he was always bout it when it came to talking about oppression against black people. But the moment he had enough money, he moved the fuck out of the hood. He moved the fuck out. And I know that the reason why was because he was trying to stay away from black people, because I ran into him many years later. And, you know, he wanted to come hang out with me. This was years ago. And I was like, oh yeah, but I'm at the laundromat, so you can drop by the laundromat by my house. And I still live in a black neighborhood. I live in a predominantly black neighborhood right now. And, you know, he came up to meet me at the laundromat, and he was hanging out with me there, and I'm waiting for my clothes to dry. And where I was doing my laundry, it was pretty ghetto, right? Like, it's this, you know, strip mall with like a grocery store and a bunch of like beauty supply places that have hair extensions and shit. And there's a Popeyes. I mean, whatever, all the stereotypes. And there were all these like, you know, baby mamas out there like doing their laundry and shopping for their kids. And he's out there with me, and he's like looking at this, and he says, boy, you know, every time I come back to neighborhoods like this, I'm reminded of why I left. And I'm just like stunned. Like we're like, I'm not saying he can't feel that way, because I understand that. See, I acknowledge that the hood is bad, and not because it's full of black people, but because it's just bad. And it just so happens that there are a lot of black people in the hood. Like, you know, and a lot of them want to get out. And this guy was one of them. And then later, when we had a debate about, you know, the problem with like why black people are suffering, I was like, well, you know, I think in part they got to take some responsibility. And he was like, no, man, it's all the man that's oppressing them and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, dude, you yourself wanted to get out. You told me. You said in my face, you know, while we were hanging out, I'm glad I left. Well, why would that be if not because you want to avoid all the crime and the single motherhood and all of the bullshit? Because, you know, I had another friend who worked in a neighborhood that was a little bit west of that place. He worked at a GameStop years and years and years ago when GameStop was relevant. And fucking that GameStop was held up by gangbangers with AK-47s. AK-47s to stick up a GameStop. They were black. Okay? That's not white people doing that. And so you gotta like ask yourself, what is acceptable to talk about? And why do people get a little bit anxious when the topic of race comes up? Because personally, I don't think it's that absurd to discuss. When you compare it to other shit, I think the gender discussion is the hardest discussion, personally. And I think that progressives have made the race discussion more difficult with their rhetoric. But when you examine the rhetoric, it doesn't make sense. I was just asking to make sure I saw what I did growing up. There's a hierarchy in terms of coupling with people from different groups. Unfortunately, blacks tend to be last with going solo preferred. Oh. Richard says blacks hate other blacks. Let me see. Africans don't like black Americans. Yeah, I think it is because Zerang, what Zerang said, it's because of cultural things. But I think that's the reason why black people don't like being around black people either. And you know what? They have problems with, everyone has problems with other people's cultures because our cultures are different. The beauty supply store I was talking about and the laundromat, both of them are owned by and run by Koreans. Okay? And those Koreans, they want to interact with the black people in the neighborhood as little as possible. In the hood, there are lots of little restaurants. Okay, they're like these little greasy spoons that you can go inside of, and there's like no chairs, and there's just like a room that is big enough for people to stand in line, and there's bulletproof glass, and like one of those it's like a spinning, like a little carousel thing that you put your money in. And then they like spin it and they take the money and they put the change in and spin it back like you might see in a gas station or something like that. And those places are all run by Middle Eastern guys. Muslims, usually, right? But run by Middle Eastern guys in the hood. Those people don't trust or like black people in general. I think that their problem mainly has to do with the culture though, and not necessarily the skin color. Although I'm sure they use the skin color to decide if they kind of use that as a basis for what to expect. But the problem is, on top of that, is they're not entirely wrong because those places get stuck up all the time. Gangbangers hang around in those restaurants late at night. They're open usually 24 hours because those guys are trying to like make money and hustle. And the beauty supply stores, you know, there's all this shoplifting that goes on. And so like they have to like, I mean, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, you know? All right. Let me see. Women aren't white people. Yeah, I think it's, I already read that part. I am generic, boring, and only season chicken when I fry it. How the hell did you know, dude? What is it with Americans and laundromats? Is it a culture thing? Well, some people can't afford a washing machine, so I can't. Conspiracy, including printing. I was just relaying information regarding feelings held by the black community. I don't necessarily think that white people don't season their children. I think that Anglos don't season their children. I don't know, man. Indians season the shit out of their shit. Closest white people get to seasoning chicken, if being fancy, is curry. I resent that. I season my chicken all the time. Does barbecue sauce count as seasoning? Yeah, but is it a gender though? Roof Koreans should be at the top of the progressive stack by definition. Corporate food season the chicken for us. They drag them through the heated water bath. Okay, you guys are talking about chicken for some reason. I don't know. I'll try to finish drawing this one figure and then I'll call it a day. Sorry that I ended up mostly ranting and not doing a lot of art today. This is the reason why I try to do these shows. This is exactly the reason why I try to like do these shows where I don't say anything, because I will rant. But I'm kind of like, I'm pissed with this whole YouTube situation. And I think that people are, I don't know. I think that the way that the conversation is going, they're playing right into the left's narrative, you know? You know what? I'm gonna rotate this a bit. Let's do it this way. End up playing defense when you should be saying, you know, how valid is this statement even? How valid is this concept? But I don't know. Maybe I'm gonna get kicked off of YouTube for asking that question. Do. There we go. That's 1, 2. Oh, the green is done. So I finished it and it's 12:59. I mean, not bad. I Kiss BBW says, spit it out, man. Get rid of it or it will stay with you for a long while. I'll do it after the show. It's kind of gross, isn't it? We're talking about chicken to make you feel more inclusive. Thank you. What? Wait, what? SJ Double Jews. Uh-oh. I'm not going down that road. You should show your face on stream before you go, Brian. Then you can save your channel. Save it from what? Oh, I get what you're saying. Oregano in summer. After that, shazlik sauce. Shazlik sauce? I don't even know what that is. Oh shit, my shit's blowing up on Twitter. Wow. Well, anyways, it's 1 o'clock. I gotta wrap up the show. I want to thank you guys for coming on and rant, like allowing me to rant about virtue signaling. I think that basically in closing, my thoughts are that the idea that all of this bullshit going on with the left is a specifically...
Here's for talking on the stream today.
Thank you, Lord of Swarm. Thank you so much. The idea that all of this is coming from a fringe amount of people that don't have a tremendous amount of influence over the conversation is absolutely false. And in fact, they don't just have some control over the conversation, they have all control over the conversation. They're dictating the conversation itself, and they don't even have to try. And as long as until we like challenge the actual conversation, like the core of it in general, it's never going to end, because people are just going to go back to talking about these ideas of racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, transphobia, etc., as though they're completely valid, which I think needs to be looked at. In closing, I'll say this with regards to that. I'm not denying that people don't experience bigotry based on their culture or their biological things about themselves that they don't have any control over. I'm not denying that at all. What I'm saying is that I think that the way in which it's being discussed is likely incorrect. The actual conversation itself is tainted, if that makes any sense. And it makes it harder for us to talk about it honestly. And I think the biggest threat to that narrative, to those narratives of Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, racism, sexism, etc., is that if we bring men into the conversation around that, and we start looking at the situation for men in every single instance that we describe as something else, I think that those things will vanish. They'll diminish to the point of nearly disappearing. And I think that idea is terrifying to progressives, because they need their victim narratives. They need an enemy to tear down. And that enemy right now is men. And they're using men to do that to other men. So this will come back to gender, because that's the one thing that is definable, that we can see clearly. All those races that I listed off, that gets really vague and messy. But men and women, that's clear as day. But let me ask you this. Think about this for a second. What is it that SJWs are trying to blur the lines of? And what is it they're trying to define clearly? They're trying to define racism clearly, even though they're using really messy methods to do so. But gender, they're trying to blur to the point of making it almost impossible to discuss. Why would you do that? That's it for me. So I want to thank you guys for coming on the Comicsgate Art stream. Please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and hit the bell for notifications. Be sure to leave me a comment and tell me what you think about the discussion as well as the artwork. I have been Brian. I'll talk to you guys later. Have a good one, everybody.